My name is Florian Eder. I'm a journalist with Politico, but I am very well aware that all of you here in the plenary hall and all of you who are joining us online are not here to hear from me, but to hear from our distinguished speakers here on the panel. No need to introduce themselves, no need to introduce them. The Prime Minister of Greece, Κυριάκου Μητσοτάκη. And of course, Mathias Cormann, the Secretary General of the OECD. Thank you for joining me here on stage, and I am looking forward to a lively discussion on the European and Greek economy in the difficult times that we're having. Maybe we kick it off before we look at the future, by an assessment of where we're at. Prime Minister, I'd like to start with you. Mathias Cormann came into office last year with a promise and a plea to build back the economy stronger after what we thought was last year's crisis, after the COVID crisis. That might have to wait a bit, or at least it has become even more complicated and more needed even, as the Western economies face an additional symmetric, maybe even shock of high inflation, and now Putin's war on Ukraine. What is your assessment of the economic situation of your country in particular and of Europe?
We're coming out of the pandemic, Florian, we were all hoping that we would be able to resume rapid growth, and we were forecasting a growth that could possibly exceed 5% for 2022. Of course, nobody thought that we would be faced with a situation where we would have a war on the European continent. And it is very clear that the Russian invasion of Ukraine will have significant economic ramifications for the global economy. We're not just talking Europe here, but I'm sure Mathias will comment on this in more detail. We still expect the Greek economy to grow substantially in 2022, but of course we will revise our growth forecasts downward. But the biggest challenge that we are all facing today are related to the prices of energy, especially the prices of gas, and the linkage between gas prices and electricity prices. And here I want to be very clear and very direct. We need to break the link between gas prices and electricity prices. If we do not do that, we will impose a huge economic pain on our citizens and on our businesses. I would hope that we are able to do this at the European level. And we've discussed this already at the level of the Council. We will have an extraordinary Council towards the end of May, where I expect decisions to be taken in that direction. We need to mobilize European resources to help all member states address this. If this does not, for whatever reason, if this does not happen, it will be up to the member states to spend more money to support businesses and households. This is what we will end up doing in Greece. It will have fiscal implications, but I would hope that we can be able to do that. We will be able to do that at the European level. And my last comment on this: if we do not do this, we will allow the forces of populism in Europe to re-emerge stronger. And as we look to build up support towards Ukraine and against Russia, it will be a terrible, terrible mistake if, for economic reasons, we will lose the support of our populations, because they will feel the pain from this invasion as intensely as the Russian citizens.
Let's come back to that perhaps in a minute, but that's a panel discussion that I love. If you're in the first question, make news already, saying that you consider it a European task for the European Union to help people with the high energy prices. Is that something that you said you would expect that extraordinary European Council meeting of your colleagues, prime ministers and presidents and heads of state and government, to take a decision? How confident are you that this is going to happen?
First of all, the Commission has done a very good job in terms of offering us options. But at the end of the day, it's up to us, to the members of the Council, to take specific decisions. And there are many ways of addressing this. I mean, we've proposed the option of putting a cap on the wholesale prices of natural gas. There are other ideas in terms of delinking gas prices and electricity prices, because the market design of the European electricity market never took into consideration the possibility that gas prices could increase tenfold. Because right now, we need to be honest, we have a non-functioning gas market. The forces of supply and demand have not really been disrupted, but the prices of gas have gone through the roof. And of course, we also have 230 billion euros of unused loans from the RRF facility. I think we need to be very creative and, with the help of the Commission, think how we can use these loans, which member states have expressed no interest in using, to repurpose them in order to help us deal with high energy prices, but also help certain member states deal with the migration crisis. We should not forget that there are countries such as Poland that are currently welcoming more than 2 million migrants, and they will also need extraordinary support. We did this back in 2020 with the RRF, and it was a huge success. I do not think that there is an appetite in the Council to increase the envelope of the funds that would be available at the supranational level. But let us be creative and think in terms of repurposing existing funds that have been approved, to help countries in the short term deal with this issue. Because there's also an energy transition element. We should not lose sight of the fact that we want to decarbonize. And this is a central theme for all of us, reducing emissions. But if people associate decarbonization with very high energy prices, we will not have the level of public support to be able to drive through these important changes.
Last question on this. You said 35 billion euros unused or unpurposed money of the existing fund. Is that about the amount of money that you think will be sufficient?
Well, that's a lot of money. Let me put it this way. No matter how you divide it amongst member states, it will have. And again, we need to be creative in terms of how we can use this this money. But this is a very expensive proposition. And again, I would hope that we will be able to do it at the European level. If we cannot do it at the European level, we need to do it at the national level. One thing is for certain: we cannot, for a long period of time, tolerate these very high prices of energy, and in particular the very high prices for electricity. We have heavily subsidized the more vulnerable households in Greece. We will continue to do so, but we probably need to do even more to be able to absorb the pain on households, but also the pain on the real economy.
Mr. Cormann, maybe you can give us a little context and a broad view on how bad this crisis hit actually the Western economies, and is it evenly distributed, or are there some that are more badly hit than others?
Well, firstly, I mean, looking back, it's sadly a statement of the obvious that the world has gone through 2 very difficult years, though the recovery from the pandemic was strong and relatively rapid compared to what was anticipated when the pandemic first hit. It was uneven, there remained downside risks, but we were actually economically and socially coming out the other end. Now, the war against Ukraine, we've always got to remind ourselves, first and foremost, it is a massive humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. People in Ukraine are losing their lives, their homes, their infrastructure, more than 4 million refugees so far. But of course, I mean, there are economic implications globally, and it's, I think it is also a statement of the obvious to say that the impact is particularly hard felt in Europe when it comes to energy prices because of geographic proximity, because of market structures, and I guess the way supply arrangements have developed in recent decades. But there are implications beyond Europe. There are implications around the world. I mean, there's been a massive supply shock, both in terms of in terms of commodities, in terms of energy-related commodities, but also in relation to food-related commodities, and there's massive additional inflationary pressure. And if you look at Ukraine, for example, as a net exporter of wheat, and a significant exporter of wheat into North Africa. I mean, there's some very serious challenges that we're looking at there in terms of food security, food affordability. Yes, in Europe, but in countries all around the world. In terms of the way we ought to look at this moving forward, we need to make calm and sensible decisions about the short term, provide temporary and targeted support to vulnerable households, means-tested support to vulnerable households, which is precisely what the government here in Greece has done, and which is something that we very much support. That is a way to provide support that doesn't add significantly further to inflationary pressures. But we also need to think about the sort of transitions and the reforms that we need to pursue in order to get ourselves in a better position over the medium to long term. And let me just support what the Prime Minister has said in relation to the European energy market structure. I understand the reasons why at some point in the past the price of electricity and the price of gas was linked in order to provide additional, to help provide more support to investment in renewable energy, and that was entirely appropriate. But we are finding ourselves in a very extreme circumstance now, and I think it is important, particularly in Europe, where the exposure and the impact when it comes to energy prices is particularly high, to consider very seriously the appropriate market design structure moving forward. I mean, there is a triple policy challenge. We've got to ensure energy security, we've got to ensure energy affordability, and we've got to ensure that the decisions that we make keep us on track to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And we've got to really think sensibly, given the circumstances and the significantly changed circumstances we're in, on how that is best achieved. Let me just sort of make, I guess in closing, a comment about Greece. And I've just had the opportunity to meet with the Prime Minister and to sort of see what's been achieved in recent years here is really fantastic. The economy here is, coming from a difficult situation not that long ago, is really heading in the right direction now. The response to the pandemic was strong. Structural reforms to improve competitiveness and fiscal credibility continued to be pursued during the pandemic, and the benefits are very clear and very obvious. High employment growth, a sharp drop in unemployment even during the pandemic, and the fact that the government here was able to pay off the final tranches of the IMF loan 2 years earlier is just such a strong signal of the performance in recent years of Greece to rebuild its fiscal credibility, which is a very strong foundation from which to boost investment, growth, and more jobs into the future.
Let me come back to the Greek economy a bit later. But what you said about the reforms that are needed now and structural reforms, you mentioned electricity market reform. What's the top 3 things that you would recommend the European Union and European countries to do now in this situation?
Well, I mean, so we're dealing with a supply shock, so we've always got to remind ourselves that. So in the short term, we've got to provide temporary, targeted, well-targeted, means-tested support to help cushion vulnerable populations here and elsewhere from that impact to the extent that we can. Beyond that, we've got to ensure that we can replace supply that has stopped or generate additional supplies, whether that is in terms of energy or whether that is in terms of wheat and other food supplies. And I guess one of our key messages is we've got to remain calm-headed and make sensible and well-considered decisions. Sometimes in the context of a crisis, the risk is that under pressure we make decisions that make a bad situation worse. And I just focus on food security as an example. There can be a temptation in the context of a supply shock to say that you want to protect your own product, that you want to impose price caps, that you want to impose export restrictions, that you want to impose export taxes to make exports harder. That would be the wrong thing to do. And so the first message is we've got to keep markets open, we've got to continue to provide the right incentives to increase production to make up for the lost productions, so that we can stabilize prices, that we can bring prices down again over time as market settings adjust, and to make sure that we can get product into all of those areas that need it, and also to avoid a massive food crisis across North Africa.
Prime Minister, do you share the concern about protectionist tendencies to come back? You were nodding when Mr. Cormann.
I think Mathias is right when it comes to food. But he's also right when he points out that the electricity market in Europe was not designed to accommodate this sort of extreme level of volatility that we see in gas prices. It was very well designed to encourage investments in renewables, but currently it does not make much sense to offer an electricity price that is determined solely by the most expensive marginal unit of electricity that enters into the system, which is gas. So you may end up using, I'll give you an example from Greece. We had, very good weather conditions over the past week, which means relatively sunny, with some wind, which means that more than 60 or 70% of our electricity can be produced from renewables, which currently are becoming much cheaper. But the price of a unit of electricity is still determined by gas, because we will need gas to make up for the shortfall. We will never be totally dependent on renewables. That is why I think it is so important to focus on the market design of the electricity market and to break that link between gas prices and electricity prices. But on food, I think Mathias is right. There are countries in our neighborhood, our immediate neighborhood, such as Egypt, for example, that are incredibly dependent on wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. And I think right now, the absolute first priority should be to help Ukraine with its harvest. We discussed this with Mathias, and I see a role also for the OECD in the next chapter for Ukraine, when hopefully this war will come to an end and when we will talk about the reconstruction of the country. But in the short term, what is imperative is to make sure that we protect as much as we can from the Ukrainian harvest.
I'm interested in a more personal aspect of this. Prime Minister, you have a reputation of very well planning ahead, and you came into office with a very clear reform agenda that you ticked all the boxes one after the other. How does this crisis and this war affect your work as Prime Minister? Is it just a year? Or you said the next elections are due next year. How much does that change just everything?
Maybe you should ask my wife. But we certainly work. Look, we did come into power with a very clear reform agenda. And we had to deal with numerous crises, because before COVID, we also had to deal with a migration crisis and with a very aggressive neighbor. We had a very difficult summer in 2020. Then we had COVID, and then now, of course, we have the war and the economic implications. But I'm quite happy that we have been able, in spite of everything extraordinary, all these extraordinary events, we were very consistent in terms of delivering on our reform agenda. We've lowered taxes on labor and income. We've made Greece a more attractive destination for foreign investment. We have many companies that are interested in investing in Greece at present. We've made the case why a geopolitically stable Greece should also be a natural target for foreign but also for domestic investment. We've strengthened our geopolitical alliances. We've put Greece on the map when it comes to the energy transition, but also we've made it very clear that we will play a role in the new energy discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, but we'll also address challenges such as labor reform, education reform, healthcare reform. I think the real challenge these days for anyone who has the privilege of leading a government is how do you split your time between day-to-day crisis management, which is going to be I'm afraid it's going to be the rule, and long-term planning. It is not easy. It obviously means you need to work even more. But you should never, I think, in my mind, lose sight of the fact that there is a bigger picture and a bigger vision towards which we work. And the vision that I laid out to the Greek people when they put their trust in our government in 2019 is still very valid. And it will also be the vision that we will present to the Greek people in 2023 when we will ask them if they want to renew their mandate. This is a long-term transformation process. for the entire country. We really want to catch up with the rest of Europe. We want a Greece that is a protagonist in Europe and no longer a laggard. And I'm happy that on the symbolic front, many of the legacies of the past decade are being addressed. You mentioned, Mathias, the fact that we've repaid our IMF loans ahead of time, symbolically very important. We were one of the first European countries to receive RRF funding. Yesterday, Valdis Dombrovskis, who was supposed to be here physically, but he handed over the European decision, giving us 3.6 billion euros, the first tranche of the RRF program. And of course, we also intend to exit the enhanced surveillance mechanism by August and reach investment grade by 2023. So as much as we focus on dealing with a short-term crisis, we need to keep in mind that we have a bigger project for the country. And sometimes in each crisis there is also an opportunity. When we talk about energy now, renewables become more important not just because they help us reach our climate neutrality targets, they become more important geopolitically. If we talk about energy independence, no one's going to take away our wind and our sun. So the faster we move in terms of licensing for renewables, the better it will be for the country. So in each crisis, there is always an opportunity to drive through your reform agenda. And obviously there are always bumps, there will be mistakes, but we never lose sight of the big picture.
You mentioned it already. Valdis Dombrovskis also said that he would expect Greece to exit the enhanced surveillance, so the last step of the program this summer, which has upsides and has carries the risk that the European Central Bank, for example, can't help as easily if there was a crisis. Is it actually a good idea in the economic crisis that we're in, that we are talking about here, to kind of lose that safety net, if you want?
Look, I mean, this is our baseline scenario, and we're working towards that goal. And again, I think it's also important to send a signal to the markets that yes, we can stand on our 2 feet. Yes, we are, a credible government that is implementing reforms. And if you look at our fiscal condition, our debt may be high as a percentage of GDP, but it has very peculiar characteristics which make it more benign to the international capital markets. It's long-term debt with low interest rates, primarily owed to official creditors. So we are making the case that we want to complete the enhanced surveillance program in August, and we're working towards that target.
And the next target you mentioned also is investment grade back in next year. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think this is also perfectly doable. Again, we all understand that there may be some slippage in terms of the fiscal targets we have set for 2022 because of the extraordinary circumstances that we are addressing, but we remain committed towards a path of fiscal sustainability. We will be reducing our primary deficits. We will have a primary surplus in 2023. And the markets will take a hard look at what it is we are doing, and I think they will take the decision that we deserve to be at at the investment grade level some point in 2023. And when we reach that point, that will put the final exclamation point on closing this very, very painful chapter for the country, which opened essentially 12 years ago with the financial crisis of 2010.
And it would for sure be a very good argument if you're campaigning for re-election by the time next year. Mr. Cormann, I would like you to invite you to comment on the Greek economy and what you are seeing here and perceiving here. Is it as well on track as the Prime Minister tells us?
Well, I think I sort of touched on this in my first answer. I mean, we very much see the Greek economy heading in the right direction, despite all of the challenges along the way, despite a very difficult starting position. And clearly there is an ambitious modernization agenda that has continued. There is an energetic support. There's an energetic pursuit of the of the opportunities from the green and digital transitions. There's pursuit of structural reforms to improve competitiveness, to rebuild that fiscal credibility, and the outcomes are there for all to see. I mean, if you look at the employment growth in the context of the pandemic, the sharp drop in the unemployment rate, when you see some of the fiscal trends, I mean, it is objectively obvious that things are heading in the right direction. And from our point of view, we're very supportive of the government continuing to engage in its reform agenda moving forward.
When you see what is happening in Europe at the moment, how big is your confidence that the EU lives up to the challenge that we see? I'm coming back to what the Prime Minister said before on the electricity prices being a European task. Is that something you think the EU should tackle as a whole?
Well, no. I mean, there is a clear EU area of responsibility here in terms of market design across Europe, and there is a very specific European challenge. I mean, we're always happy to provide policy support and guidance if that is asked for, of course. But I mean, if you look at the European Union's history over the last several decades, I mean, it's always easy to look at all of the things that still need to be fixed and that still need to be done better. But I mean, let's be honest. I mean, the European Union has performed exceptionally well and has been a very important part of ensuring peace, prosperity, and stability across the continent. I mean, it's tragic to see that we have a return to war on our doorsteps, or on the doorsteps of Europe. But the European Union is an incredibly effective platform in facilitating discussion and in facilitating consensus on the right way forward. Now, this is an unresolved issue. It's an issue that needs to be talked through, and obviously we would like to see that there is a sensible resolution on the other side. But I mean, I think everybody in Europe is conscious of the problem. Everybody knows that there is a need to reduce dependence and reliance on Russian oil and gas and coal. Everybody understands some of the medium to long-term challenges, and there is a conversation underway on how best to get there. And I'm confident that ultimately that will lead to a consensus position about the right way forward.
What we see here is, of course, a symmetric shock, if you wish, but the impact is actually asymmetric. You mentioned it. You touched upon it, that the map of energy supply, of the global map of energy supply, is being redrawn at the moment, which inevitably will have winners and as well have losers. Is there a risk that you can see that the unity that we see in the West, in particular, that we see in the West at the moment, would suffer from that because some are, because of that very fact?
Well, it's certainly true that, I mean, the unity of purpose and the strength of solidarity across market-based free democracies around the world is very strong, and that is, of course, very welcome. And it's going to be important to carry that forward, not just to deal with the immediate crisis, but to also deal with some of the reforms required to put us on the best possible trajectory over the medium to long term. And it is true that the impact is different in different parts of the world, and the opportunities to help find solutions are different in different parts of the world. And it's more important than ever in this context to have strong international cooperation, in particular, I guess, among like-minded countries, but beyond like-minded countries too. I mean, in the end, we've got to ensure that beyond the family of like-minded market-based democracies around the world, that we have the capacity to solve global problems, global challenges cooperatively. There are red lines, and an unprovoked war of aggression, against any international law is a very big red line. But in terms of global affairs and in terms of dealing with the challenges of our time, I think that effective and balanced multilateralism is more important than ever, including to deal with some of those challenges that you mentioned over the medium to long term.
Prime Minister Mitsotakis, a similar question to you. The sanctions against Russia that are in place have been in the G7 mostly very carefully designed and balanced. So what Mr. Cormann said, that everybody could contribute, but also the impact was more or less evenly distributed. Do you think there is a risk that this will not hold for very long?
Well, first of all, I think you're right to point out that this is a symmetric shock, but there are always winners and losers also within the Western world, especially when it comes to energy. And that is why I think that like-minded countries, Western democracies, the US, Australia, the countries that have imposed sanctions, need to also strengthen their cooperation when it comes to the global energy market. Why am I saying this? The EU has agreed with the US an important deal to import LNG from the US in order to start replacing Russian gas. Maybe we could do a similar deal with Australia. Australia is one of the big LNG exporters together with US and Qatar. And of course, for these deals to make sense, we should not just talk about security of supply, but we should also talk about prices. There is a lot of money that's being made currently in the global LNG market. Very low production cost, but a price that is extremely high. So I think there is scope for more cooperation. When we look at, for example, the European energy market, and we're discussing, the possibilities of price caps, we need to make sure that we will not affect the LNG market and that we have enough LNG to cover for whatever disruptions we may have in the gas supply. That's why I think this level of cooperation between like-minded countries needs to be strengthened. Now, on sanctions, again, the question returns to how much pain will European societies suffer from the energy crisis. We've imposed draconian sanctions on Russia. They are already, and they will be very, very painful. But that is why I think we need to muster the European firepower to cushion the blow on the European citizens. And this is something that we can do. Mathias was right. He mentioned, I think, the positive side of the European integration story, which we tend to forget. This has been a hugely successful experiment. Speaking as a Greek who has been a member of the European family for more than 40 years, I can attest to that. But also, if you look at our most recent experiences, how we dealt with vaccine purchases. The RRF was a milestone in the process of European integration, the ability of Europe to borrow at the supranational level and finance member states through grants and loans. This was something which was inconceivable 2 years ago, and we need the same level of ambition when it comes to addressing the impacts of energy. Because at the end of the day, we are democracies, and this is our big strength. We should not turn our strength into a weakness. I will again come back to the argument that if we do not address this challenge, there will be forces of populism from the extreme right or for the extreme left that will take advantage of this. And you look at European countries that are currently in a campaign mode, and you will easily understand how dangerous this is for the whole European experiment. At the end of the day, our job is to protect our citizens, in particular the most vulnerable citizens. And we have demonstrated through the RRF that this is something that can be done. This will have a huge impact on our economies, and it will not just affect, as many people think, big businesses or the big investors. When we, for example, are channeling RRF funds into renovation programs, which is one of our flagship RRF programs, we benefit the end customer who will pay lower energy bills. We benefit local industry because the building materials are Greek. We benefit the local, self-employed plumbers or the people who installate the new installation. So these are the sort of win-win projects which are financed through the RRF. But let us not lose sight of how painful these increases in the prices of energy are for everyday citizens. And that is why a European approach, a European assistance in this context is going to be so important. And I'm sure that we will demonstrate at the end the same level of ambition than we did 2 years ago when we set up the RRF. Again, when I remember I was one of the first heads of state and government who sent out a letter asking for an RRF type of instrument. And at the time there was huge resistance, even from countries such as Germany. But they understood, and Chancellor Merkel understood at that point, that this was something which was necessary. I think the same level of necessity is also currently present. And I'm sure that Europe is again going to sort of rise to the occasion and offer some level of European solution to a problem that is essentially European.
A small question on that. The fear of populism, of the rise of populism again, is of course very, very tangible in several European countries. What does that tell you? They are at the same time they are the pressure is mounting on Germany and Austria and others to no longer block a complete embargo of Russian energy. Are these calls something you would want to join, or are they not very helpful?
It is not helpful at present to talk about a complete ban on the import of Russian gas. I'm very clear on this. It is we cannot replace Russian gas from one day to the next. But let us look at the functioning of the market and come up with realistic solutions. What we cannot accept is a solution that will put us in a weaker position than Russia. I mean, the point of sanctions is that we're willing to incur some pain, but at the end we are inflicting more pain on the country which is the target of sanctions. If we get this mix wrong, we will have essentially shot ourselves in the foot.
Mr. Cormann, you're nodding. Is that? Do you agree?
Well, it's a matter of making sensible decisions. It's certainly true that the whole purpose of sanctions is to inflict, more pain against the aggressor and to minimize the negative impacts in your own economies. And when it comes to energy, it's a matter of making very cool-headed decisions about what you can and should be doing in the short term and how you can put yourselves in the strongest possible position for the medium and long term. And if there's a choice between improving the market design to ensure that you can sensibly replace and ensure that you've got appropriate supplies, appropriate energy security, which will help with prices, more affordable prices and price stability in a way that over time is also consistent with our climate objectives, then that is preferable to ending up in a situation where you've got to put massive fiscal support, distortionary fiscal support into economies, I guess, to deal with some of the industrial and competitiveness implications that would otherwise emerge. So I'm very much in favor of making cool-headed, sensible decisions, very much focusing in on what can and should be done in the short, the medium, and the long term.
We are coming to the end of our discussion already. I can see at the clock. As we are in this magical and beautiful place in Delphi, and I was at the archaeological sites this morning, I just want to ask a question to each of you. At the end, if you had the chance to ask the Oracle of Delphi, what is the one question that you would want to have an answer to? Mr. Cormann, if you want to begin.
Well, I mean, I would very much like to know how soon we can have a return to peace in Ukraine, and how soon the brave people of Ukraine can have a return, can get to a position of rebuilding and reconstructing their country, and so that we can go in and help and support them to the best of our ability.
Prime Minister.
The Oracle was notoriously good at always offering the answers that you wanted to hear. That is why it survived for so many years. Maybe a good skill for some politicians, not my type of skill certainly. But I would agree with Mathias. I think the $1 million question is how quickly will the war end? What will the peace settlement look like? And again, I will end on where you started. At the end of the day, this is a huge humanitarian tragedy. Very personal to us in Greece, because we have more than 100 Ukrainians of Greek origin living in eastern Ukraine, especially in the city of Mariupol, and that is why we have committed to participate in the reconstruction of Ukraine, and not just by rebuilding the maternity ward that was bombed during the first days of the war, but we would actively want to play a part in this effort, and we're of course always trying to also help with evacuation of desperate people. So this should be our number one priority, but I'm not sure that the oracle in her confused state of mind would be able to offer a clear answer to this question.
Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Secretary General Mathias Cormann, I thank you both very much for being here.